First of all, thank you to Dan and Cato for inviting me to speak and share the experience of Hong Kong in our management of public finance. First of all, a quick snapshot of what we are, where we are. I use 1997 as a kind of benchmark because it is a year when we returned to Chinese sovereignty. As a special administrative region, have a separate economic, taxation, political, and legal system. In about the 17 years since we revert to Chinese sovereignty, we run budget surpluses for 12 years and 5 years of deficits. For this financial year, our spending is about 57 billion. And to give you a perspective, New York City has a budget spending of 80 billion of about 8 million people. So the spending is about roughly the same scale. They have more population, so we are about 15% less on a per capita basis. Hong Kong has no debt, and we have something what we call the fiscal reserves, which many economies don't have. That is a piggy bank, where we put our reserves. That is accumulated on a basis, which is 110 billion US dollars, which is equivalent to 37% GDP and 23 months of government expenditure, meaning that we could survive 2 years without a cent of income. Top salaries tax payers pay 15% max. It's 15, not 50, right? And the effective tax rate is 8%. So there are people who earn less who pay less. It's a step rate, but it's capped at 15%. Corporates pays a flat tax of 16.5 on profits, all right? And that is income derived and sourced within Hong Kong. So there's no global taxation. We have no GST, no VAT, no withholding or tax on interest, dividend, inheritance, and whatnot. Revenue profile, profits and salaries are the main areas. We have something called stamp duty, which is charged on property and stock transactions. Has something we call investment income. We have invested our fiscal reserve, and that account for about 10% of our income. Sizable income from land revenue, land premium, because all land belong to government, and every year we auction land for the right to use, not to own. And that is a sizable income. Expenditure profile is not very different from any other countries. So the big spenders will be education, social welfare, and healthcare. This year we have a big blip in infrastructure spending because we will be reaching quite a spending peak for some of the mega infrastructure program, like a big bridge that we built across to Macau, which is 18 miles. And we will be digging through Hong Kong with a kind of tunnel, a high-speed rail link that connect up with the mainland China's high-speed rail network, which is all tunnel. We have very strong fiscal discipline, which is basically 4 factors: historical, constitutional, legal, and policy. Historically, we've been under British administration for 155 years as a colony, and the Brits are very keen to make sure that it won't be a burden to the crown. So they have to make sure that Hong Kong is self-sufficient so that we don't have to hand out a hand and to our sovereign to ask for money. So we have a big succession of financial secretaries who's been very strict, very faithful disciple of Adam Smith, small government and big market. To the extent that one financial secretary actually refused to collect statistics on things because he said that if you start collecting statistics, there is a kind of incentive for you to interfere with the market. So he refused to collect statistics about things like unemployment and things like that. And of course, after we have reverted to Chinese sovereignty, we are under constitutional arrangements whereby Hong Kong will run its own affairs. Hong Kong people administering Hong Kong, one country, two systems. And we have in our constitution a requirement to keep expenditure within revenues and to run budget balance, prevent deficits, and budget commensurate with the growth of our GDP. And we are required by our constitution to be a low tax policy regime. And of course, like many other countries, the legislature will approve the budget and spending. And there's one very clever provision that we call Article 74, which provides that bills which do not relate to public expenditure may be introduced by the legislature. We interpret to mean that the legislature that is Congress in this country, cannot introduce bills with the charging effect unless you have the approval of the executive branch. So you could imagine how politicians will be resisting the temptations to propose measures that will increase expenditure. So the legislature in Hong Kong cannot propose bills that will increase expenditure unless the executive branch agrees. We have what we call a public finance ordinance, which basically provides a legal framework for management of public finance, and all revenues will belong to the center, that is a central pocket. So departments who collect revenue cannot spend it without authorization. And we have an annual appropriation bill, which prescribes the spending ceiling as well as the headcount ceiling. That is, not just the amount of money that you can spend, but the number of people an agency can hire. And all works projects, bricks and mortars, over $4 million will require separate authorization by the legislature. And any change to the job description of what we call director officers, who are policy officers, will have to get separate authorizations as well. Policy-wise, resource allocation is very highly centrally controlled and highly centralized and highly competitive. Every year we will identify a pot of money, what we call new money. Basically, an agency will be given their baseline, and this pot of money will be available for bidding by different agencies, and they will have to put up proposals to the center for allocation. And in the process, we are very strict, and I can even describe it as very hostile towards spending which is recurrent in nature, meaning that it's year after year. So we are very hostile to suggestion of new hire of civil servants and spending that is recurrent in nature. And we are particularly hostile to things like what we call entitlement programs here. The only entitlement program in Hong Kong is the civil service pension that I enjoy. And other than that, things like social welfare, housing, medical services, none of them are backed up by legislation. They're all like spending program, which is subject to authorization year after year. And of course, for civil service pension, we have dropped that in the year 2000. So from that year onward, all new hire will only be entitled to a provident fund scheme, which is a defined contribution scheme, not a defined benefits scheme. So we're plugging that loophole as well. And we're also preferring expenditure rather than revenue incentives. What I mean is that here or in many Western countries, when government wants to, for example, encourage research and development, they will have all these fancy deduction schemes. Like, for example, you can have double or triple deduction for spending on R&D. We are very hostile to it because we think that it is very non-transparent, and you cannot really account for that kind of what we call revenue spending, which is an oxymoron, right? This kind of revenue spending on policy areas. So we prefer to have expenditure schemes. For example, if you think that R&D is worthy of support, we should not have these fancy deduction schemes, but we would prefer a grant to a certain area, which is expenditure. And the legislature can see it, the public can see it, and you could really monitor the trend. So we are very hostile, and we really prefer expenditure schemes rather than revenue schemes. And we also have periodic exercises to do what we call attack the baseline. So I was saying that we give allocation basically every year to give agency their baseline. But once in a while, we will do exercises, what we call attacking the baseline, where we have to claw back money from the baseline for allocation for new services. So it keeps agencies and government departments on our toes, and we'll be, even though with a very healthy fiscal situation we are enjoying, I will be facing what we call a 0-1-1 kind of clawback in the next 3 years. This will be 0% for this year. I'll have to claw back 1% to the center for them to allocate. And the year after, another 1%. And we have this also a very informal spending guideline. It's not prescribed in legislature, not prescribed in our constitution, but is followed by successive governments. We try not to exceed 20% of our GDP in terms of our spending. and we try to maintain adequate reserve. It is very vague, I know. Different financial secretary has different interpretation of what is adequate. And it's also sometimes quite practical because, as I said, we have 5 years of deficits, which is coincide with the kind of downturn in the Asian financial crisis. And we have to pare down our fiscal reserve to something like 12 months of government expenditure. And at the time, the financial secretary, our meaning of adequate reserve is 12 months. and then it's changed. But now this financial secretary said is adequate reserves. But I think it's always been very conservative. Basically, our philosophy is that we spend within our means. We don't try to afford programs that we cannot afford, and we do not want to give an undue burden to our next generation. Challenges, I think, is like many other political systems. We have facing constant pressure from the legislature, from politicians, from the public to tax more and to spend more. So when they're talking about spending, they're all been trying to learn from experience in the West about providing for a universal retirement protection scheme, which is funded by the state. But of course, we have to ask question whether it is sustainable and where the money will come from. And we're also facing a situation like many places in developed countries, an aging population. Now, every elderly person, 65 and above, is supported by 5 working population. In the year 2040, one elderly person will be only supported by 2 working population, meaning that we will be facing more spending on social welfare, medical services, while on the other hand, our revenue base would shrink. So we'll have to tackle that as well. Our tax base is very narrow because it's, as you can see, the tax rate is really low, and actually 60% of salaries tax come from the top 5% earners, and 80% of the profit taxes come from 5% of the companies. So you can imagine that in a situation when we have an economic downturn, the revenue base will shrink very rapidly, and it's very volatile and cyclical. So what we are embarking on something that our local population thinks that we are crazy, because as you can imagine, you have $110 billion of reserve, equal to 23 months of government expenditure. And we are sounding the alarm because of the aging population issue. We are saying that we will probably have a problem sort of 10, 15 years down the road. So we are now thinking about a longer-term strategy of maintaining fiscal sustainability, which will involve containing expenditure growth, safeguarding the tax base, save more for the future, as well as managing our assets more cleverly. These are topics that are being floated, and we have not yet been able to find to announce specific measures, but we hope to be able to do so in the next 6 months or so. We expect that there will be quite a bit of discussions because I think there is, as I mentioned, quite a bit of pressure for us to spend more. But on the other hand, I think from the fiscal sustainability point of view, of course, we have to comply with the Constitution. So far, nobody has sued us for violating that fiscal balance provision while we are in a deficit. But I think we'll have the keenly aware that we have a constitutional obligation to run a balanced budget, and as well as to ensure that what we provide for will be fiscally sustainable in the future. Right. Thank you.